Do you know what are the triggers in database and how it works? If your answer is yes, then you can very well skip this video. Otherwise, do watch this video till the end, because in this video, we'll talk about the concept of triggers in database. This video primarily talk about triggers in DB2, but the fundamental concept is the same for all the other databases, for example SQL Server, Oracle, or maybe any other RDBMS database. So ladies and gentlemen, once again welcome back to our channel, and in this video we'll talk about triggers in DB2. So if you're new to our channel, then please consider subscribing to our channel because we need your support to grow our channel. So let's get started. So we start today's session with an introduction. After that, we'll talk about what are triggers and how does a trigger work in DB2. Thereafter, we'll talk about the type of triggers that is supported by DB2 and how exactly DB2 triggers are different from DB2 stored procedures. We will also learn how to define or create trigger on an individual table and what are the different parameters that you have to specify when you are creating trigger with the help of SQL statement. And we'll conclude this session with an example and a live demo so that you can understand how exactly things work behind the scene. So let's get started. Large-scale enterprise applications use database to store their data, and depending on the functionality of the system, an application program processes the data. So they can retrieve and they can store data as per the requirement. The application layer includes the core business functionality, and it resides between the user and the DBMS. It is responsible for communicating the user request to the DBMS system. It is also responsible to send the response from the DBMS to the user. Now, as you know that application layer contains core functionality, but it is not possible to include complete functionality at the application layer, because it would eventually downgrade the application performance and increase application running cost. So to extend the capability of conventional programming, modern databases such as IBM DB2, Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle, MongoDB, or maybe Amazon Aurora, they have introduced the concept of trigger and stored procedure. And with the help of triggers in DB2 or any other database, you can build an active database that can respond naturally to an event that is happening on a specific table. Now let's move on to our next slide and try to answer a couple of questions. So the first question is, what are triggers in DB2? So in layman term, triggers in DB2 are piece of code that is executed in response to a data modification operation. So when an insert, delete, or update operation is performed on a table or a view, then database automatically execute a trigger. So it is actually a counter reaction to a specific operation which is performed on the table. Now let's move on to our next question, that is, how do you execute triggers? So as you know that triggers are automatic in nature and they will be fired by the database in response to an action. And the important point is that you cannot bypass or invoke trigger explicitly with the help of any program. They are stored and maintained by the database. You can only define trigger on a specific table, and rest it's the database job to keep a track and to execute trigger as and when it is required. Now let's move on to our next question, that is, when to use triggers. So triggers are very useful when you have a piece of code that you want to execute periodically based on a predefined event. This does not mean that you should use trigger for all scenarios because they are expensive and you cannot ignore the cost involved in supporting trigger. So it is eventually important to consider all factors before making a decision about trigger. You must consider cheaper alternatives such as constraint before choosing triggers. Now let's try to understand the entire concept of trigger with the help of an example. So here's a COBOL DB2 application or a COBOL DB2 program that is using embedded SQL statements to perform either insert, update, or delete operation on a DB2 table based on the business functionality. So DB2 database treat this data modification operation as an event, and as an action to this event, database manager will going to initiate or automatically fire trigger which is defined on that individual table. And remember, it is not possible to bypass trigger in case if it is defined on an individual table. So even if you try to execute an SQL statement with the help of any tool, even then also triggers will be invoked by database manager. Now let's talk about the benefit of using triggers in DB2. So first and foremost benefit of trigger is that it can be used to consistently apply business rules to any database operation from any application, user, or a user interface. DB2 triggers improve database consistency across table, and in fact it improves auditing and controls by performing non-database functions such as sending a confirmation text message, sending a message to a system operator, or sending an email. Last but not the least, triggers can be cascade. For example, a trigger which is defined on table 1 can change table 2, which result in the activation of trigger on one or more tables. This powerful capability can result in many changes to the database based on a single change in a single table. Now let's move on to our next slide where we will try to understand the types of trigger in DB2. So DB2 support 4 different categories of trigger. So first one is insert trigger, second one is update trigger, and third one is delete trigger, and the last one is instead of trigger. So the first three, one that is insert, update, and delete, they are self-explanatory. So whenever you perform any data manipulation operation on a table on which trigger is defined, and that data modification operation is either insert, update, or delete, then DB2 manager will going to initiate or execute the code which is defined in those triggers. The last category of trigger, that is instead of trigger, is significantly different from the other three triggers that we have discussed so far. Instead of triggers are defined on views, and they contain a logic that is required to enable non-updatable view to become updatable. And remember that this particular trigger converts non-updatable view into an updatable. So the instead of triggers differ in purpose and functionality from the general purpose modification triggers. Now let's move on to our next slide. So in this slide, we'll talk about the basic difference between trigger and stored procedure. So let's talk about triggers first. So triggers are event driven and they are attached to a single table. So that means that you always define trigger on an individual table. Triggers are executed automatically by the database and they cannot result a result set. On the other hand, you have stored procedures, and stored procedures are not event driven and they are not associated to any single table. Stored procedure can be executed via external calls, and stored procedure can result a result set. So that is the basic difference between DB2 triggers and DB2 stored procedures. Now let's move on to our next slide and try to understand how you can create trigger with the help of SQL statement. Now as you know that SQL, that is structured query language, plays a very crucial role when you want to interact or to store data in your database. So without SQL, you cannot interact with a database and eventually you cannot do anything with the database. So there are different kinds of SQL statements, and if you want to learn more about these SQL statements, you can check out a video on our YouTube channel, that is what is SQL and what are the different categories of SQL. Now coming back to our trigger section. So you generally use create SQL statement to create object within your database. So in this case, we would be using create SQL statement along with couple of important parameters. So let me just walk you through with all the important parameters that you have to specify in case if you want to create or define a trigger on a specific table. The SQL statement starts with a create keyword and after that you have to specify these parameters in a specific sequence. So the first parameter is trigger name, and it is used to specify the name of the trigger. And always remember that you should use a unique and a meaningful trigger name. Thereafter you have trigger table, and it is used to specify the name of the table on which the trigger exists. Next we have activation, and it is used to specify whether the trigger fire before or after the data modification. The next one is triggering event, and the statement that caused the trigger to fire, that is insert, update or delete. Next one is granularity. It indicates whether the trigger fire for each row or for each statement. Next is transition variables or table, and it indicates the name to be used to reference the information prior to or after the data modification. Next, you have trigger condition. This is an optional, and it is used to specify whether the trigger action that follows is only executed when the condition is satisfied. Now, before going through the example, let me highlight a couple of important points that you should always remember before defining the trigger. So the first and foremost point is that you should clearly understand on which table you want to define trigger. So you should only define trigger for those tables where you want to monitor the activity. For example, insert, update or delete. Next thing is you should be very clear about the event that should initiate the trigger. For example, it should be an insert operation, update or delete operation. The next important decision is to know when to activate the trigger, that is before the activity or after the activity. The next important decision that you have to make is regarding the granularity of trigger. So you should always determine based on different factors. So first and foremost thing is that SQL is a set level language. So whenever you execute an SQL statement, so it can either have an impact on one row, two row, or maybe n number of rows depending on the selection criteria. So you should clearly know whether you want to initiate or activate trigger on a single row or on a multiple rows based on an SQL statement. Now let's look at some sample triggers to see how these clauses can be combined into a create trigger statement. So the following example is a simple update trigger that is created with the help of create trigger statement. This trigger, that is salary underscore update, implement a simple check to ensure that the salary increments are less than 50%. When the new salary exceeds 50% of the prior salary, an error message is raised. The trigger will execute once for each row. So if multiple rows are modified by a single update, then trigger will run multiple times. That is once for each row. Also, the trigger will run before the actual modification of salary column for individual row. Finally, take a special notice of how new and old values are used to check value before and after the update. Now let's move on to our next example where we'll try to solve a business problem. So the problem statement is that you need to create a trigger that can automatically keep a track of number of new employees that are joining a company. So this trigger will actually interact with two different tables. First one is an employee table, which is actually used to hold the employee details. For example, employee ID, employee first name, last name, and any other detail which is related to an employee. After that, you have one more table that is employee new hire table. And this table only keep a track of number of employees that have joined the company. So let's try to understand how we can just solve this problem with the help of triggers. Now the solution to this particular problem is divided into four different steps. So in first step, we're going to define trigger on employee table, and the name of the trigger is new underscore employee, and this trigger will be activated or fired whenever you try to insert a record in an employee table. And whenever this particular trigger is fired, it will going to update the record count or employee count in new hire table. In next step, I'm going to check the employee count value in new hire table just to showcase the value of employee count before inserting a record in employee table. In third step, I'm using insert SQL statement to insert a record in an employee table. and I'm inserting a record with employee ID as 100501 and other relevant details associated with an employee. So after inserting, if my record is inserted successfully, then the trigger will be activated and it will increment the count of EMP-CNT column. So whatever be the value, it will going to increment that by 1. In last step, I'm actually using SQL select statement to check the value of employee count from employee new hire table. And with the help of this, you can easily understand whether your trigger has been activated or not when you have inserted a new record in your employee table. Now let's move on to our next section where I'm going to showcase the practical demonstration of what all we have learned so far. And for that, I'm using IBM DB2 database on Windows platform. And to save time, what I've done is I've already written all these SQL statements and they're commented right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to execute these statements one by one and I'm going to explain on the fly. So if you notice that I'm using a DB visualizer as an IDE that is interacting with my DB2 database, which is running on my laptop right now. And if you notice the right hand side of the screen, then you'll see that right now I'm connected to a database and there are different schemas which is available. And in Topictrick schema, you will find there are different tables. And in that table, you have a table called employee. So you remember that we would be interacting with this table because it is holding the data related to an employee. And the second table is new hire, and this table keep a track of number of employees that have been hired by an organization. And the counter in this particular table will be incremented as and when you insert a new record in employee table. So let's discuss our first example where we have created a salary underscore update trigger, and that will going to trigger a error message whenever your salary is increased more than 50%. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to execute the select statement, and this statement will going to showcase the employee ID, first name, last name, and salary for an employee with employee number as 10. So if I execute that, you'll just notice that right now the salary of this particular gentleman is 1527.50, right? So let's just copy that and put it somewhere. Okay, I've just kept that. Now after that, what I'm going to do is, now let me create trigger on this particular table. So right now, as you notice that we do not have any trigger. So let me just go ahead and create a trigger on this. So I'll be using create trigger statement to define trigger on employee table. Now let me execute this statement and our trigger is successfully defined. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the salary of an employee that is more than 50%. So what I'm doing is I'm using update SQL statement and then I'm using set salary equals to salary into 2.0. So that means I'm just multiplying the existing salary by 2. So that will actually increase salary more than 50%. So my statement is executed, and if you notice, you have get an error message that says that salary increased by 50%. So that means our trigger is initiated when you try to change the salary of an employee that is more than 50%. Now let me re-execute this update statement, and this time I'm not increasing salary more than 50%. So what I've done is I've just multiplied the salary with 1.2, which is way less than your 50%. So in this case, let's see how our trigger going to behave. So my statement is executed and this time I have not got any error message. So the employee salary is incremented, but it is less than the 50% increment. Now let me discuss the second example where we are tracking the new hire in a company. So in this case, let me define a new underscore employee trigger on the employee table. So let me execute this create trigger statement. So this has been executed and our trigger is being defined on employee table. And remember, this is a second trigger, right? Now let me quickly select the employee count from employee new hire table. And if you notice right now, the count is 0. Now let me try to insert a new record in an employee table. And once this record is successfully inserted, the count in employee new hire table will be incremented by 1. So let me just showcase the count right now in employee new hire table. So if you notice, The previous value was 0 and now the value is 1. So that means our trigger is activated as soon as our new record was inserted in employee table. And just in case if you want to drop the trigger that you have defined on a table, then you can very well use drop trigger SQL statement. So you have to use drop followed by trigger keyword, and thereafter you have to specify the trigger name. And when you execute that, this statement will drop the trigger that you have defined on a specific table. Now let me quickly showcase how trigger looks when they have been defined on a table. So let me just quickly refresh that. And if you notice, under the trigger section, you have two different triggers which we have created during this particular demo. First one is salary underscore update, and second one is new underscore employee. So this is how things look on Windows platform. And in case if you're working on IBM mainframe, then you would be using a separate tool that is interacting with DB2 database and that can showcase what all triggers have been defined on the table. So ladies and gentlemen, this marks an end to our today's session on DB2 triggers. And in case if you have any question, then do write that question in comment section. We're going to respond back after this presentation. If you like this video, then hit the like button and share it with your friends who actually want to learn triggers or the trigger concept in relational database management system. So ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you so much for watching this video. Bye bye and take care.